The music stopped the moment Charles Pemberton raised his hand for silence, and Eleanor Whitmore felt her heart stop with it. She stood near the tall windows of Lord Averley's ballroom, a glass of ratafia forgotten in her gloved hand, watching the man she had been promised to since she was 17 years old, walk to the center of the floor. He looked handsome in his dark blue coat, his fair hair catching the candlelight, and for one foolish moment Eleanor believed he meant to announce their wedding date at last. She had waited 3 years for this. She had told herself patience was a virtue, that Charles needed time to settle his affairs, that a proper gentleman did not rush into marriage without securing his fortune first. She was wrong about everything. Charles cleared his throat and smiled at the crowd, the same easy smile that had once made Eleanor believe she was the luckiest woman in Hampshire. He reached out his hand, and Eleanor's closest friend since childhood, Louisa Fairfax, stepped forward from the crowd wearing a gown of pale gold silk that Eleanor recognized because she had helped choose the fabric for it herself, only weeks before. "Friends," Charles said, his voice carrying easily across the hushed room, "I have the great honor tonight of announcing my engagement to Miss Louisa Fairfax." For a moment, Eleanor thought she had misheard him. She looked at Louisa's face, searching for some sign that this was a jest, some private joke between old friends that Eleanor had simply not been told about yet. But Louisa was not laughing. Louisa was gazing up at Charles with an expression of quiet triumph, her cheeks flushed pink, her fingers already curling around his arm as though she had practiced the gesture in a mirror. The room erupted into polite applause and low murmurs. Eleanor felt every eye in the ballroom shift toward her, the way a flock of birds turns as one when startled from a hedge. She was, after all, the woman everyone knew had been promised to Charles Pemberton. She was the woman who had sat beside his mother at church every Sunday for 3 years. She was the woman whose name had been linked with his in every drawing room from London to Winchester. And now she was nothing at all. Eleanor's glass trembled in her hand, and she set it down on a nearby table before it could betray her further. She kept her spine straight, the way her mother had taught her, the way a lady was meant to stand no matter what storm broke around her. She would not cry. She would not give this room the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. But her mind was screaming with questions. How long had this been arranged? How many evenings had Louisa spent in Charles's company while claiming to visit her ailing aunt? How many letters had passed between them while Eleanor sat at home embroidering handkerchiefs with his initials, believing herself a devoted and patient betrothed? She caught sight of her mother across the room, Margaret Whitmore's face gone pale as chalk, one hand pressed to her chest. Her father, Henry Whitmore, looked as though he wished to cross the floor and strike Charles Pemberton across the jaw, though of course he would do no such thing. A gentleman did not brawl at a ball, no matter how deeply his daughter had been wronged. Eleanor forced her feet to move. She would not stand rooted to this spot a moment longer, a curiosity for every gossiping tongue in the county. She turned toward the doors that led to the terrace, walking with a measured pace that cost her every ounce of strength she possessed, and slipped out into the cool night air. The terrace was empty, thankfully, save for the distant sound of crickets and the faint golden light spilling from the ballroom windows behind her. Eleanor gripped the stone balustrade and finally allowed herself to breathe, though the breath came out as something closer to a sob. 3 years. 3 years of her life given to a man who could not even summon the courage to end things properly before choosing another woman. And not just any woman, but Louisa, who had sat beside her at every dinner party, who had confided in her about every small disappointment, who had, only a fortnight ago, held Eleanor's hand and told her she hoped Charles would set a wedding date soon, so that Eleanor might finally be happy. The betrayal had 2 faces, and both of them had smiled at her for years while planning this humiliation. "You should not be standing out here alone in the cold." The voice startled her, low and unfamiliar, coming from the shadows near the far end of the terrace. Eleanor turned quickly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her glove, furious with herself for being caught in such a state. A tall man stepped into the light spilling from the windows. Eleanor recognized him at once, though she had never spoken to him directly. The Duke of Ashbourne. Alexander Vane. He was rarely seen in society, and when he was, he rarely lingered. There were whispers about him, of course, the way there were whispers about every wealthy, unmarried duke, though the whispers about Ashbourne were quieter and stranger than most. Some said he had loved once and lost her. Some said he simply had no patience for the games the ton insisted on playing. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Eleanor said, straightening at once, mortified that a duke of all people had witnessed her in such disarray. "I did not realize anyone else was out here." "There is nothing to forgive." He did not smile, but there was something gentle in the way he studied her, something that felt entirely unlike pity, and for that alone Eleanor was grateful. I saw what happened inside. It was a cruel thing to do, and crueler still to do it before an audience. Eleanor's throat tightened. She had expected pity from everyone tonight, soft murmured words meant to comfort, but which only reminded her of her own humiliation. She had not expected plain honesty. "I do not require your sympathy," she said, more sharply than she intended. "I have not offered you sympathy," Ashbourne replied evenly. "I have offered you an observation. There is a difference, though I understand why you might mistake one for the other tonight." Eleanor looked at him more closely then. He was younger than she had assumed from his reputation, perhaps 30 years of age, with dark hair and eyes the color of a winter sea. There was nothing soft in his face, nothing that invited easy conversation, and yet he had not turned away from her the way everyone else in that ballroom surely had. "You do not know me, Your Grace," she said quietly. "No," he agreed, "but I know what it is to stand in a crowded room and feel every pair of eyes measuring your misfortune. It is not an experience one forgets." Something in his voice told her he was not simply being polite. There was a weight behind his words, a history she could not begin to guess at. But before she could ask him what he meant, the terrace doors opened behind them, and Eleanor's mother appeared, her face a mixture of relief and alarm. "Eleanor, there you are. Come, we must go home." Eleanor glanced back at the Duke, uncertain what to say, uncertain even what had just passed between them. He inclined his head, the barest, most correct of bows. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I hope the rest of your evening proves less trying than its beginning." She managed only a small nod before her mother took her arm and led her swiftly toward the waiting carriage, past the ballroom windows where laughter and music still spilled out into the night, as though nothing at all had happened, as though a woman's entire future had not just been shattered in front of 200 witnesses. The carriage ride home was silent except for her mother's occasional soft murmur of comfort. Eleanor stared out the window at the dark countryside rushing past, her reflection ghostly and pale against the glass. She thought of Charles's easy smile. She thought of Louisa's flushed, triumphant face. And strangely, beneath the ache of humiliation and betrayal, she found herself thinking of a stranger's steady voice on a cold terrace, telling her that what had happened to her was cruel, and that he understood, in some way she could not yet explain, exactly what she was feeling. She did not know then how much that brief exchange would come to matter. She only knew that for the first time all evening, someone had looked at her and seen something other than an object of pity. By the time the carriage reached Whitmore House, Eleanor had made herself a private promise. She would not spend the coming months as a tragic figure for the county to whisper about. She would not shrink into the shadows simply because Charles Pemberton and Louisa Fairfax had decided her heart was theirs to break so carelessly. She did not yet know how she would rebuild what had been taken from her, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she intended to try. Her father was waiting in the hall when they arrived, his expression grim. He said nothing at first, only crossed the room and embraced his daughter, and Eleanor finally allowed the tears she had refused to shed in public to fall freely against his shoulder. "I will not let this be the end of you," he murmured against her hair. "Whatever else happens, Eleanor, I promise you that." Upstairs in her room, long after the house had gone quiet, Eleanor sat by her window and looked out at the dark garden below. Somewhere across that same night sky, in some other grand house, Charles Pemberton was likely celebrating his engagement with champagne and laughter, utterly unconcerned with the wreckage he had left behind him. But Eleanor found her thoughts returning, again and again, to a pair of steady gray eyes on a moonlit terrace, and a voice that had offered her nothing but honesty when the rest of the world offered only pity. She did not know his story. She did not know why a duke known for his coldness had chosen to speak so plainly to a stranger in her lowest moment, but something told her, as she finally climbed into bed and closed her eyes against the ache in her chest, that tonight's humiliation would not be the last time their paths crossed. And somewhere beneath the grief and the anger and the sting of betrayal, a small, stubborn part of her almost hoped she was right. Sleep did not come easily that night. Eleanor lay awake listening to the old house settle around her, the familiar creak of the floorboards, the wind moving through the elm trees outside her window. She thought of all the small moments over the past 3 years that she had mistaken for devotion. Charles bringing her flowers before a dinner party. Charles complimenting her needlework in front of his mother. Charles promising, again and again, that their wedding would come as soon as circumstances allowed. She had believed every word, because she had wanted to believe them, because the alternative, that he had simply been passing the time until something better presented itself, was too painful to consider. She thought too of Louisa, and the ache there was sharper still. A broken engagement could be explained away as a man's fickle nature, but a friend's betrayal cut in a different place entirely, a place Eleanor had never thought to guard. She remembered whispered secrets shared over tea, long walks through the garden discussing books and dreams, the quiet comfort of believing someone truly knew her heart. All of it now felt like a performance she had not known she was part of. Toward dawn, when the sky outside her window had begun to soften from black to gray, Eleanor finally allowed herself one small comfort. She thought again of the terrace, and the stranger who had not offered her pity, only truth. She did not understand why his words had settled into her chest the way they had, or why, of everything that had happened that terrible night, it was his steady voice she kept returning to. But it gave her something to hold on to in the darkest hour before morning, a single point of quiet steadiness in a night that had otherwise taken everything from her. When sleep finally came, it was thin and restless, but it came all the same, and Eleanor Whitmore woke the next morning changed, though she could not yet have said exactly how. The letters began arriving before breakfast, 3 of them stacked neatly on the silver tray beside Eleanor's plate, and she knew from the careful, apologetic handwriting on the topmost envelope exactly who had sent it. She did not open Louisa's letter. She set it aside without breaking the seal and reached instead for her tea, though her hand was not quite steady. "You must read it eventually," her mother said gently from across the table, though she made no move to press the matter further. "Must I?" Eleanor kept her eyes on the window, on the gray morning light falling across the garden. "I do not see why. There is nothing she can write that will change what she has done." Margaret Whitmore said nothing more on the subject, though Eleanor caught the worried glance her mother exchanged with her father over the teapot. It had been 4 days since the ball at Lord Averley's house, 4 days since Charles Pemberton had stood before 200 guests and chosen another woman, and in that time Eleanor had left the house exactly once, for church, where she had endured an hour of sideways glances and hushed whispers that followed her like a second shadow. She was beginning to understand the peculiar cruelty of pity. It wore the mask of kindness, soft voices and gentle touches on the arm, and yet it left her feeling smaller with every encounter. Mrs. Hartley from the neighboring estate had clasped her hands after the service and told her, with tears actually forming in her eyes, that Eleanor was so very brave to show her face so soon. Brave, as though Eleanor had done something requiring courage, rather than simply existing in the aftermath of another person's choices. By the second week, the letters from Louisa had grown to 7, all unopened, all stacked in the bottom drawer of Eleanor's writing desk beneath a shawl she rarely wore. She did not know why she kept them rather than burning them outright. Perhaps some small part of her still wanted an explanation, even if she was not yet ready to read it. It was her father who finally raised the subject that mattered most, on a quiet evening in his study, the fire crackling low and the household otherwise settled for the night. "I have been thinking about our situation," Henry Whitmore said, setting down the papers he had been reviewing. "Pemberton's conduct has done more than wound your heart, Eleanor. It has done damage to your standing, and I would be a poor father if I pretended otherwise." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. She had not allowed herself to think too far past the immediate pain of betrayal, but her father's words dragged the larger truth into the light. A broken engagement, especially one broken in so public and humiliating a fashion, left a mark. Society did not always ask who had been wronged. It simply noted that a woman had been left standing alone, and drew its own conclusions about why. "What would you have me do?" she asked quietly. "Nothing rash," her father said. "But I will not have you hide yourself away as though you have committed some sin. You have done nothing wrong, and I intend for the county to remember that, in time." Easier said than accomplished, Eleanor thought, though she appreciated the sentiment behind his words. The following afternoon, Louisa Fairfax arrived at Whitmore House unannounced, and Eleanor was given no warning until the maid appeared at the parlor door to say that Miss Fairfax was waiting in the front hall, and would not be turned away. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse the visit entirely. Her second, stronger instinct, born of a stubbornness she had not fully appreciated in herself until this moment, was to face the woman who had wronged her, rather than hide from the confrontation. Louisa looked pale when Eleanor entered the front hall, her hands twisted together in front of her, none of the triumphant glow she had worn at the ball. For a moment, neither woman spoke. "Eleanor," Louisa began, "I have written to you 7 times. I understand you have not read my letters, but I beg you to hear me now, in person, if you will grant me nothing else." "You have 5 minutes," Eleanor said, her voice cool and even, though her heart was pounding beneath her composed exterior. "I suggest you use them wisely." Louisa's eyes filled, though Eleanor felt no immediate sympathy for the tears. "I never meant for it to happen this way. Charles and I, we did not plan for our feelings to grow as they did. It began as friendship, comfort, nothing more, and then you decided my closest friend and my betrothed made a more convenient match than my closest friend and my happiness, Eleanor finished for her. How fortunate for you both that convenience and affection align so neatly. That is not fair, Louisa said, though her voice wavered. Fair, Eleanor repeated, and something hard and cold settled into her chest, steadying her where grief had left her shaking for days. You wish to speak to me of fairness. You sat across from me at countless dinners, Louisa, and told me how happy you were for my coming marriage. You held my hand not a fortnight past and wished me joy. Was every one of those words a lie, or did you simply not consider my feelings worth the truth? Louisa had no answer for that, and her silence told Eleanor everything she needed to know. I do not require your apology, Eleanor continued, drawing herself up to her full height. I require only that you leave, and that you understand this house is no longer open to you. Whatever we once were to each other, it ended the moment you decided my humiliation was an acceptable price for your happiness. Louisa left in tears, and Eleanor stood alone in the front hall for a long moment afterward, surprised by how steady she felt, how the confrontation had left her not weaker but stronger, as though some final tether to her old life had been cut clean, freeing her from a weight she had not realized she was carrying. That evening, word reached Whitmore House through a servant's gossip that Charles Pemberton had been overheard at his club suggesting that Eleanor's coldness of manner had contributed to his change of heart, that perhaps she had never been quite affectionate enough to hold a man's devotion. Eleanor received this news with a strange, distant calm. She had expected the whispers to turn cruel eventually. She had not expected them to turn so quickly, or so unfairly, laying the fault for his own conduct at her feet as though she were somehow responsible for his choices. Let them talk, her mother said fiercely, when Eleanor relayed the rumor at supper. Small men always find a way to make their failures someone else's fault. Despite herself, Eleanor found the ghost of a smile at her mother's words, the first genuine smile to cross her face in nearly 2 weeks. But the whispers did not stop, and over the following days, Eleanor began to notice a slow, quiet withdrawal from the social circles that had once welcomed her without question, an invitation to a card party that never arrived. A polite but distant nod from a woman who had once been a friendly acquaintance at church. Small slights, each one insignificant on its own, but together forming a pattern Eleanor could not ignore. She resolved, in the privacy of her own room, that she would not go begging for the county's approval. If society wished to believe Charles Pemberton's version of events, there was little she could do to change every mind. But she would not shrink from public life entirely either, not when doing so would only confirm the whispers that painted her as broken, unworthy, a woman to be pitied rather than respected. It was nearly 3 weeks after the ball when Eleanor received an unexpected invitation, delivered by a liveried footman she did not recognize, bearing a seal she had seen only once before, pressed into wax the color of dark wine. The Duke of Ashbourne requested the pleasure of the Whitmore family's company at a small gathering at his estate, Ashbourne Park, the following Thursday evening. Eleanor stared at the card for a long moment after her mother had read it aloud, her mind returning unbidden to a cold terrace and a pair of steady gray eyes. Curious, her father remarked, turning the invitation over in his hands. Ashbourne rarely entertains. I cannot recall the last time he opened his home to guests outside his own family. Perhaps he simply wishes for company, her mother suggested, though there was a knowing note in her voice that made Eleanor's cheeks warm slightly. Perhaps, Eleanor said, careful to keep her tone neutral, though her heart had quickened in a way she was not entirely prepared to examine. She thought of his words on the terrace, the plain honesty of them, so different from every soft, useless kindness she had endured since. She did not know what to make of an invitation from a man so famously private, a man who had spoken to her for perhaps 10 minutes total, and yet had left a stronger impression than 3 years spent beside Charles Pemberton. That night, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself standing before her wardrobe far longer than necessary, considering which gown she might wear to Ashbourne Park, and immediately felt foolish for the thought. It was only a small gathering. It meant nothing beyond simple civility, a duke extending an ordinary courtesy to a family of his acquaintance. And yet, as she finally climbed into bed and closed her eyes, Eleanor could not quite banish the small, warm flicker of anticipation that had settled somewhere beneath her ribs, entirely separate from the grief and anger that had governed her every waking thought since the night of the ball. For the first time in weeks, she found herself looking forward to something, and she fell asleep still turning that strange, unfamiliar feeling over in her mind. The days leading up to Thursday passed slowly, filled with small domestic tasks that did little to occupy Eleanor's restless thoughts. She helped her mother inventory the linen cupboard, sat through an uncomfortable tea with an aunt who could not stop mentioning Charles Pemberton's name, as though testing to see how much pain the word still caused, and spent long hours in the garden with a book she found herself unable to read past the first page. It was during one of these garden hours that her younger cousin, Grace Whitmore, arrived from the neighboring parish for an extended visit, and Eleanor found herself grateful beyond measure for the distraction. Grace was 2 years younger, quick with laughter, and blessedly untouched by the gossip that had settled so heavily over Eleanor's own household. "I heard what happened," Grace said carefully, settling onto the garden bench beside her cousin. "I am so sorry, Eleanor. Truly." "Everyone is sorry," Eleanor said, though not unkindly. "I begin to think sorrow is the only emotion this county is capable of feeling toward me now." "Then let us feel something else instead," Grace said, with the bright, uncomplicated determination of youth. "Tell me something that is not about Charles Pemberton or Louisa Fairfax. Tell me anything else at all." And so, somewhat to her own surprise, Eleanor found herself describing the terrace at Lord Averley's ball, the cold night air, and the stranger who had spoken to her with such unexpected honesty. She left out his identity at first, curious to hear what her cousin would make of the story without the weight of a title attached to it. "He sounds interesting," Grace said, eyes bright with curiosity. "Who was he?" "The Duke of Ashbourne," Eleanor admitted, and watched her cousin's eyebrows rise in surprise. "Ashbourne, truly? I have heard he never speaks to anyone at these gatherings, that he stands in corners and leaves before the first dance is finished. My mother says he has not properly courted a woman in years, not since some unhappy affair before he came into the title." "I know nothing of his history," Eleanor said, "only that he did not look at me the way everyone else did that night. He did not offer me pity." Grace studied her cousin's face for a long moment, a knowing smile beginning to form at the corner of her mouth. "And now he has invited your entire family to his estate. Eleanor, I do not think that is a coincidence." "It is only a small gathering," Eleanor said quickly, though the warmth in her cheeks rather undermined the casual tone she attempted. "A courtesy, nothing more." "Perhaps," Grace said, though her smile remained, "or perhaps a duke who speaks to no one at balls has found someone he wishes to speak to after all." Eleanor changed the subject after that, though her cousin's words lingered with her long after Grace had gone inside to help with supper preparations. She told herself firmly that she would not allow her imagination to run ahead of the facts. She had exchanged perhaps a dozen sentences with the Duke of Ashbourne. It would be foolish, even dangerous, to build any expectation atop so slight a foundation, especially so soon after her heart had been so thoroughly and publicly broken. And yet, when Thursday finally arrived, Eleanor found herself standing before her mirror with unusual care, smoothing the folds of a deep blue gown that had always suited her coloring well, and wondering, despite every effort not to, whether the Duke of Ashbourne would remember their brief conversation at all. Her mother appeared in the doorway just as Eleanor fastened the small string of pearls at her throat, pausing to study her daughter with an expression that mixed hope and caution in equal measure. "You look lovely," Margaret Whitmore said softly. "It is good to see you taking care with your appearance again. I confess I worried, these past weeks, that you had lost your taste for such things entirely." "I have not lost anything, Mother," Eleanor said, meeting her own gaze steadily in the mirror. "I have only been finding my footing again." "There is a difference." Her mother crossed the room and pressed a gentle kiss to her daughter's temple. "Whatever tonight brings, Eleanor, know that your father and I are proud of how you have carried yourself through all of this. Not every woman would have shown such quiet strength." Eleanor said nothing, but she held the words close as the carriage was brought round, and as her family set off through the darkening countryside toward Ashbourne Park, she allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that the evening ahead might offer something other than more pity, more whispers, more reminders of all she had lost. She did not yet know what the Duke of Ashbourne wanted from her family's company, but for the first time in nearly a month, she found she was curious rather than afraid, and that alone felt like the first true step toward reclaiming the life that had been so carelessly taken from her. Ashbourne Park rose out of the darkness like something from a half-remembered dream, its windows glowing gold against the deep blue of the evening sky, and Eleanor felt her nerves tighten as the carriage rolled up the long gravel drive. She had told herself, repeatedly, that this was nothing more than a small social gathering, that she would exchange perhaps a few polite words with their host, and spend the remainder of the evening in ordinary conversation with the other guests. She had not expected, upon entering the grand entrance hall, to find the gathering smaller than she anticipated, no more than a dozen guests total, a arranged not for a formal ball but for quiet conversation over supper and cards. Miss Whitmore. The Duke of Ashbourne appeared at her side almost the moment she stepped through the doorway, and Eleanor found herself momentarily at a loss for words. He looked different in the warm light of his own home than he had on that cold moonlit terrace, his dark coat impeccably tailored, his expression carrying none of the guarded distance she had heard others describe. "I am glad you could attend. Your Grace." She dropped into a proper curtsy, grateful for the years of training that allowed her body to perform the correct motions even as her mind scrambled to find something intelligent to say. "Thank you for the invitation. It was unexpected." Was it? A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth, there and gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it. "I confess I hoped it might be a welcome one, whatever else it was." Before she could respond, her parents were drawn into conversation with another couple, and Eleanor found herself walking beside the Duke through the grand hall, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and toward a smaller drawing room where a fire crackled warmly against the evening chill. "I must ask," Eleanor said, once they had found a quiet corner somewhat removed from the other guests, "why you extended this invitation, Your Grace. I do not flatter myself that my family holds any particular importance in your circle." Ashbourne considered the question seriously before answering, which Eleanor found she appreciated more than any quick, practiced reply could have offered. "I have found, in my experience, that the tongue is remarkably efficient at deciding who deserves compassion and who deserves scorn, often based on nothing more substantial than gossip and appearance. I watched you carry yourself with considerable dignity through a genuinely cruel evening, Miss Whitmore. I thought you deserved better company than whispers behind fans." "That is a kind sentiment," Eleanor said carefully, "though I confess I wonder if there is more to it than simple kindness." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, perhaps, that she had pressed the matter rather than accepting the polite explanation at face value. "You are direct," he said. "I find I prefer that to the alternative." "My directness has not always served me well," Eleanor admitted. "I am told it contributed to the end of my engagement, according to the gossip currently circulating my county." "Then the gossip is wrong," Ashbourne said, with a firmness that startled her. "A man does not abandon a woman of genuine character for a lack of warmth. He abandons her because his own character was never sufficient to recognize what he had." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a tightness she had carried since the night of the ball beginning, however slightly, to ease. "You speak with unusual conviction on a subject you know little about, Your Grace. Perhaps I know more than you assume." He turned to look out the window at the darkened gardens beyond, and for a moment his expression grew distant, shadowed by something Eleanor could not quite name. "I too was once cast aside in a manner I did not deserve, though the circumstances differed from yours. It taught me a great deal about how quickly society forgets the truth in favor of a more entertaining story." "What happened?" Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted the question, certain she had overstepped. "Forgive me, that was not my place to ask." "It is a fair question," he said, and though his voice remained even, Eleanor sensed the careful control it took him to speak of it. "Some years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Cecilia Ashford. She ended our engagement rather abruptly, and rather than admit her own change of heart, she allowed rumors to circulate suggesting I had treated her poorly, that I was cold and unfeeling. It was easier for her, I suppose, to let me bear the blame than to admit she had simply found someone she preferred." "That is a cruel thing to endure," Eleanor said softly. "It taught me patience," Ashbourne replied, "and it taught me to recognize the particular loneliness that comes from being publicly misunderstood. I saw that same loneliness in your face on the terrace, Miss Whitmore, and I found I could not simply walk past it." They were interrupted then by the announcement of supper, and Eleanor found herself seated, by design or coincidence she could not say, near the Duke's end of the table, engaged for the remainder of the meal in conversation that ranged from books to travel to the management of country estates. She found him surprisingly easy to speak with once the initial formality had eased, quick-witted in a dry, understated way that made her laugh genuinely for the first time in weeks. "You have a wonderful laugh, Miss Whitmore," remarked an older woman seated across the table, a Mrs. Pembridge whom Eleanor did not know well. "It is good to see you in such spirits, given recent events." The comment, though not unkindly meant, sent a small ripple of awkwardness through the nearby conversation, and Eleanor felt her cheeks warm as several heads turned discreetly in her direction. But before the moment could sour, Ashbourne spoke. "Recent events have clearly failed to diminish Miss Whitmore's wit or her company," he said smoothly, his tone carrying just enough weight to close the subject without appearing to scold his guest. "I count myself fortunate that she agreed to attend this evening." The conversation moved on, and Eleanor caught the Duke's eye across the table, offering him a small, grateful smile that he returned with the barest inclination of his head. It was such a small gesture, and yet it meant more to her than any of the soft, pitying words she had endured over the past weeks. He had not made her humiliation the center of attention. He had simply, quietly, redirected the conversation and allowed her to remain exactly what she wished to be in that moment, a woman enjoying an evening among pleasant company, rather than a cautionary tale for the county to discuss. After supper, the guests dispersed into smaller groups for cards and conversation, and Eleanor found herself once again in the Duke's company, this time in the estate's grand library, where towering shelves of leather-bound volumes rose toward a painted ceiling, depicting some ancient mythological scene she could not immediately identify. "This is remarkable," she said, turning slowly to take in the sheer scope of the collection. "I have never seen so many books in a private residence." "My father began the collection," Ashbourne said, watching her with quiet interest as she moved along the shelves, "though I confess I have added considerably to it myself over the years. Books make agreeable company when human company proves disappointing. A philosophy I find myself increasingly inclined to share," Eleanor said, though there was a wry humor in her voice rather than genuine bitterness. "I hope you will not retreat entirely into books, Miss Whitmore," Ashbourne said. "Whatever Pemberton's failures, they should not cost the world your company entirely." Eleanor turned to look at him, surprised by the directness of the statement, and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something careful and considering, as though he were weighing exactly how much to reveal. "You speak as though my company holds particular value to you, Your Grace," she said, her heart beating a little faster than she cared to admit. "Perhaps it does," he said simply, and did not look away. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Eleanor did not have a name for, something that felt entirely different from the comfortable, familiar affection she had once believed she felt for Charles Pemberton. This was sharper, more immediate, and it left her feeling both unsettled and strangely alive. Before either of them could say more, the library door opened, and Ashbourne's younger sister, Charlotte, appeared, breaking the moment with cheerful obliviousness. "Alexander, Mrs. Pembridge insists you settle a dispute about the proper scoring of whist," Charlotte announced, then paused, glancing between her brother and Eleanor with evident curiosity. "Forgive me, am I interrupting something?" "Not at all," Ashbourne said, though Eleanor noted the slight tightness in his voice that suggested otherwise. "Miss Whitmore, may I present my sister, Lady Charlotte Vane?" "A pleasure," Eleanor said, dropping into a small curtsy, grateful for the interruption despite herself, needing a moment to steady the strange rush of feeling the Duke's words had stirred in her. Charlotte studied Eleanor with open interest for a moment longer than strict propriety allowed, then smiled warmly. "I have heard my brother mention you, Miss Whitmore. It is rare that he speaks so favorably of anyone." "Charlotte," Ashbourne said, a note of warning in his voice, though it held no real severity. "I only mean to say," Charlotte continued, entirely unrepentant, "that it is good to see him in company he clearly enjoys. Now come, before Mrs. Pembridge accuses someone of cheating, and the whole evening collapses into chaos." Ashbourne offered Eleanor an apologetic glance before following his sister from the library, and Eleanor remained behind for a moment, her hand resting against the spine of a worn leather volume, her mind turning over everything that had passed between them that evening. She followed a few minutes later, drawn by the sound of laughter from the drawing room, where the card tables had been arranged and Mrs. Pembridge was indeed loudly insisting that Lord Averley had miscounted his tricks. Eleanor took a seat beside Charlotte, glad of the young woman's easy company, and found herself drawn into a game of whist that proved far more entertaining than she had anticipated. "You play well," Charlotte remarked, studying Eleanor's cards with evident approval as they won a hand together against Mrs. Pembridge and a quiet gentleman named Mr. Fenwick. "My brother rarely invites anyone who can hold their own at cards. Most of his acquaintances bore him within the first quarter hour." "I take that as a compliment then," Eleanor said, smiling despite herself. "You should," Charlotte said. "Alexander does not extend invitations lightly, Miss Whitmore, whatever impression his behavior this evening might have given you to the contrary." Eleanor glanced across the room to where Ashbourne stood in quiet conversation with Mr. Fenwick, his expression composed and unreadable to anyone who had not spent the past hours studying the small, subtle ways his guarded manner softened when he thought no one was watching closely. She wondered how much of what Charlotte said was simple sisterly pride, and how much was genuine observation. "Your brother has been very kind to me," Eleanor said carefully, unwilling to reveal more than that to a woman she had only just met, however friendly she seemed. "Kind," Charlotte repeated, with a knowing look that reminded Eleanor uncomfortably of her cousin Grace's earlier teasing. "Yes, I suppose that is one word for it." The evening wore on pleasantly, the fire burning low in the grate, the conversation drifting easily between cards and lighter subjects, county matters, the weather, a forthcoming assembly in the neighboring town that several of the guests intended to attend. Eleanor found herself relaxing more fully than she had in weeks, the tight, watchful tension she had carried since the ball slowly loosening beneath the warmth of genuine, undemanding company. Near the end of the evening, as the other guests began gathering their things and calling for their carriages, Ashbourne appeared at Eleanor's side once more, offering to walk her out to where her family waited. "I hope this evening has offered some small measure of relief," he said quietly, as they walked together through the grand entrance hall, "from whatever burdens the past weeks have placed upon you." "It has offered a great deal more than that, Your Grace," Eleanor said honestly. "I confess I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be treated as more than a subject of gossip." "You are considerably more than that," Ashbourne said, his voice low and certain. "I hope, in time, the rest of the county comes to recognize what I saw within the first moments of our acquaintance." Eleanor felt her breath catch slightly at the sincerity in his tone, and she found herself searching for some suitably composed reply, though nothing adequate presented itself before they reached the front steps, where her parents waited beside the carriage. "Might I call upon your family next week, Miss Whitmore?" Ashbourne asked, his formal words carrying a weight that suggested they meant considerably more than simple courtesy. "I should like to continue our conversation, if you are amenable." Eleanor glanced toward her father, who gave the smallest, most encouraging of nods, before turning back to the Duke. "I would like that very much, Your Grace," she said, and meant every word of it. The carriage ride home passed in comfortable silence, Eleanor's parents exchanging quiet, satisfied glances that she pretended not to notice, her own mind still turning over every word Ashbourne had spoken that evening. She thought of his steady gray eyes, the careful honesty with which he had described his own painful history, the quiet way he had shielded her from Mrs. Pembridge's clumsy comment without making a scene of it. Nothing about his attention felt like the practiced charm Charles had once shown her, all easy smiles and empty promises. This felt deliberate, considered, as though every word he chose carried genuine weight behind it. Word of the evening spread through the county with surprising speed, as word of anything involving the reclusive Duke of Ashbourne tended to do. By the following afternoon, Eleanor's mother reported that Mrs. Hartley had already called at 3 separate houses to discuss the matter, and that the general consensus among the local gossips was one of considerable surprise, tinged with no small amount of envy. News reached Charles Pemberton's household as well, though Eleanor did not learn the particulars until later, only that her name had apparently been mentioned in connection with Ashbourne's at a gathering Charles himself attended, and that his reaction, according to a servant who repeated the tale to Eleanor's own maid, had been one of visible and unflattering irritation. Eleanor found she took no small satisfaction in that report, though she was careful not to let the feeling govern her thoughts too completely. She had not accepted the Duke's attention as a means of wounding Charles Pemberton's pride, whatever satisfaction his discomfort might provide. She had accepted it because, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, she had spent an evening feeling genuinely seen, genuinely valued, by a man who asked nothing of her except honesty in return. As she prepared for bed that night, Eleanor allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that the coming weeks might bring something she had not expected to find again, so soon after her heart had been so publicly broken. The possibility of a future built on something steadier and truer than the foundation Charles Pemberton had so carelessly abandoned. She did not know what to make of the Duke of Ashbourne, or of the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had settled in her chest over the course of the evening. She only knew that, for the first time since Charles Pemberton had stood before that ballroom and chosen another woman, she had spent an entire evening without once thinking of her own humiliation, without once feeling like an object of pity rather than a woman worthy of genuine interest and respect. When the carriage finally carried her family home well past midnight, Eleanor sat quietly against the cushioned seat, watching the dark countryside slip past the window, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to imagine a future that did not revolve entirely around the wreckage Charles and Louisa had left behind. "You seem to enjoy yourself this evening," her father observed, watching her with quiet interest. "I did," Eleanor admitted, surprised by how true the words felt. "More than I expected to, certainly." Her mother said nothing, but Eleanor caught the small, knowing smile that passed between her parents in the dim carriage light, and for once, she found she did not mind it at all. As the carriage rolled on through the darkness toward Whitmore House, Eleanor found her thoughts returning, again and again, to the moment in the library when Ashbourne had said her company held particular value to him, and to the way his eyes had held hers without hesitation or apology. She did not know where this strange, unexpected connection might lead, but for the first time since her world had shattered before an entire ballroom, she found herself genuinely curious to discover the answer. True to his word, the Duke of Ashbourne called upon Whitmore House the following Tuesday, arriving not with the fanfare of an elaborate carriage and liveried outriders, but simply, on horseback, accompanied only by a groom who waited patiently near the stables while his master was received in the front parlor. Eleanor had spent the better part of the morning attempting to appear as though she had not spent the better part of the morning anticipating his arrival, a pretense her mother saw through immediately and declined to comment upon beyond a single knowing glance. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, rising as he was shown into the parlor, offering the correct curtsy, while her heart performed something considerably less proper against her ribs. "Miss Whitmore." He bowed, and Eleanor thought she detected the faintest trace of something warmer than formal courtesy in his expression as he straightened. "I hope I have not called at an inconvenient hour." "Not at all," Margaret Whitmore said smoothly, gesturing him toward a chair near the window. "We are delighted to receive you." The conversation began formally enough. Discussion of the weather, of the state of the roads following recent rain, of Mrs. Pembridge's ongoing dispute with her neighbor over a boundary hedge that had apparently escalated into something approaching a minor scandal. But as the visit stretched past the customary quarter hour that polite society dictated for a first call, and Eleanor's mother found reasons to occupy herself elsewhere in the room, the conversation between Eleanor and Ashbourne settled into something quieter and more genuine. "I confess," Ashbourne said, once they had exhausted the safer subjects, "I did not call today merely to discuss hedges and rainfall, Miss Whitmore." "No?" Eleanor asked, though she had suspected as much from the moment his card had been delivered. "I wish to see you again," he said simply, without the elaborate flattery she might have expected from another suitor. "I have found myself thinking of our conversation at Ashbourne Park a great deal this past week." "As have I," Eleanor admitted, deciding that honesty, the very quality he seemed to value most, served her better than false modesty. "Though I confess I am still uncertain what to make of your attention, Your Grace. It has been a difficult season for my confidence in matters of the heart." Something in his expression softened at that, understanding rather than impatience. "I would not ask you to trust easily, Miss Whitmore, given what you have endured. I only ask that you allow me the opportunity to prove myself different from the man who failed to appreciate what he had." Eleanor studied him carefully, searching his face for any sign of the practiced charm she had learned, painfully, to distrust. She found none. What she found instead was a quiet steadiness, a man who chose his words with evident care and seemed entirely unconcerned with performing for an audience. "Very well," she said finally. "I will not promise you my trust outright, Your Grace, but I will not refuse the opportunity to earn it either." "That is more than I hoped for," Ashbourne said, and the small smile that accompanied the words transformed his usually guarded expression into something considerably younger and more open. Over the following weeks, his visits became a regular fixture of Eleanor's days. He called twice, sometimes 3 times weekly, bringing books he thought she might enjoy, discussing everything from politics to poetry with an intelligence and attentiveness that Charles Pemberton had never shown her, not even in the earliest, most hopeful days of their courtship. He asked her opinions and genuinely seemed to weigh them, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He remembered small details she mentioned only in passing, a preference for a particular flower, an aversion to a certain composer's music, and referenced them again in later conversations, with a thoughtfulness that left her quietly astonished. "He is nothing like Charles," Eleanor confided to her cousin Grace one afternoon, as they walked together through the garden while Ashbourne met privately with her father in his study, a visit whose purpose Eleanor suspected but did not yet dare to name aloud. "Charles made me feel admired. Alexander makes me feel understood. I did not realize, until now, how different those two things truly are." "And which do you prefer?" Grace asked, though her teasing smile suggested she already knew the answer. "I think," Eleanor said slowly, working through the realization even as she spoke it, "that admiration fades the moment something more convenient presents itself. Understanding does not." It was not all uncomplicated joy, however. Word of Ashbourne's regular visits to Whitmore House spread quickly through the county, and Eleanor found herself once again the subject of considerable gossip, though the tenor had shifted noticeably from pity to something closer to envious speculation. She overheard, more than once, whispered suggestions that she had somehow schemed to capture the reclusive Duke's attention, that her apparent grief following Charles's betrayal had been calculated rather than genuine, a performance designed to draw sympathy that might, in turn, draw a far greater prize. The accusation stung more than Eleanor cared to admit, though she found, increasingly, that she had Ashbourne's steady presence to help her weather them. When Mrs. Hartley made a pointed comment at church about the remarkable speed of Eleanor's recovery from her broken engagement, it was Ashbourne, seated beside her family that Sunday at her father's quiet invitation, who responded with a calm, cutting observation about the dangers of mistaking another person's dignity for calculation, delivered with such smooth authority that Mrs. Hartley found nothing further to say on the subject. "You did not need to defend me," Eleanor told him afterward as they walked together along the churchyard path while their family spoke a short distance away. "I am capable of managing Mrs. Hartley's comments on my own." "I do not doubt your capability, Miss Whitmore," Ashbourne said, "but I find I have little patience for watching people speak carelessly about someone I have come to care for a great deal, particularly when their careless words are so plainly unjust." The word care settled into Eleanor's chest with unexpected weight, and she found herself momentarily unable to summon a response, caught between the lingering caution Charles had taught her to carry and the growing certainty that Alexander Vane was, in every meaningful way, nothing at all like the man who had broken her heart before an entire ballroom. "Thank you," she said finally, simply, and found that the words carried more sincerity than any elaborate speech could have managed. Toward the middle of that autumn, a local assembly was held in the neighboring town, the kind of modest gathering Eleanor might once have avoided entirely, given her diminished confidence in appearing before the wider county. But Ashbourne had asked to escort her, and with her parents' blessing, Eleanor found the courage to attend, dressed in a gown of deep green, that Ashbourne, upon seeing her, complimented with a directness that left her cheeks warm for the better part of an hour. The evening began pleasantly enough, filled with dancing and easy conversation among guests who had, by now, grown accustomed to seeing Eleanor in the Duke's company. But partway through the evening, Eleanor felt a familiar prickle of unease travel up her spine, and turned to find Charles Pemberton and Louisa Fairfax, now several months into their own engagement, standing near the refreshment table, watching her with undisguised interest. "I had wondered if we might encounter them eventually," Eleanor murmured to Ashbourne, who followed her gaze and immediately understood.
"Would you prefer to leave?"
he asked quietly, his tone entirely free of judgment, offering the choice without pressure either way. "No," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the firmness of her own answer. "I have spent enough months avoiding rooms because of what they did. I will not avoid this one." Charles approached first, his expression carrying an uncomfortable mixture of forced pleasantness and poorly concealed curiosity, Louisa trailing a step behind him with far less confidence than she had displayed at the ball months earlier. "Eleanor," Charles said, offering a shallow bow. "You look well, and your grace, I had not realized you and Miss Whitmore were so well acquainted." "We are," Ashbourne said simply, offering no further explanation, his tone perfectly civil and entirely unbothered, which seemed to unsettle Charles considerably more than open hostility might have. "I am glad to see you recovered from our unfortunate circumstances," Charles continued, and Eleanor felt her jaw tighten at the careful phrasing, as though the ending of their engagement had been some mutual misfortune, rather than a decision he alone had made, and made so publicly cruel in its execution. "I would not describe your conduct as unfortunate circumstance, Charles," Eleanor said, keeping her voice light and even, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her lose composure. "I would describe it as a choice, one I have found, in the months since, that I am considerably grateful for." Louisa's cheeks colored at that, though she said nothing, and Charles's easy smile faltered slightly at the edges. Ashbourne remained silent beside her, his presence steady and unhurried, offering wordless support without ever stepping in to speak for her, a distinction Eleanor found herself appreciating more with every passing moment. "I am glad," Charles said finally, though his tone suggested the opposite, "that you have found such distinguished company to console you." "Miss Whitmore requires no consoling," Ashbourne said then, his voice cool and precise, carrying just enough weight to end the conversation, without descending into open confrontation. "I have simply had the good fortune to come to know her character, which I find considerably more substantial than I imagine you ever properly appreciated." Charles had no ready answer for that, and after a moment of awkward silence, he offered a stiff bow and steered Louisa away toward the far side of the room, leaving Eleanor and Ashbourne alone once more. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, watching them retreat, "for not letting him have the last word." "You would have managed it yourself," Ashbourne said, but I confess I take some satisfaction in denying him the opportunity to feel superior, even briefly." Eleanor laughed, genuine and unguarded, and found the tightness in her chest that had gathered the moment she spotted Charles and Louisa across the room finally beginning to ease. "I begin to think, Your Grace, that you enjoy confrontation rather more than your reputation suggests." "Only," he said, offering her his arm as the musicians struck up a new set, "when the cause is worth defending." They danced together for the remainder of the set, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since the night of her humiliation, entirely unbothered by the presence of the two people who had once caused her such profound pain. Whatever power Charles Pemberton and Louisa Fairfax had once held over her happiness, she realized as she moved through the familiar steps beside Alexander Vane, had quietly, decisively slipped away. It was during this same period that Eleanor learned, through her father, of a deeper reason behind Ashbourne's earlier reticence in society, one that added new dimension to the connection growing steadily between them. His broken engagement to Cecilia Ashford had occurred some 6 years prior, and in the aftermath, Ashbourne had withdrawn almost entirely from the social circles that had once welcomed him eagerly, choosing instead to focus his energies on managing his extensive estates and, according to her father's careful account, on quietly supporting several charitable ventures throughout the county that he had never once spoken of himself. "He is not a man who seeks recognition for his kindnesses," her father observed, watching Eleanor's face carefully as he shared this information. "I have made inquiries, Eleanor, as any careful father would. Everything I have learned speaks well of his character, and considerably better than what I once believed of Charles Pemberton, to my great and lasting regret." "You could not have known, father," Eleanor said gently, though she appreciated the sentiment behind his words. "Perhaps not," he said, "but I intend to know a great deal more before I permit history to repeat itself where you are concerned." Eleanor found herself grateful for her father's careful vigilance, even as her own instincts, sharpened rather than dulled by her earlier heartbreak, told her increasingly that Alexander Vane was exactly the man he appeared to be, steady, honest, and genuinely invested in her well-being, rather than his own convenience. As autumn deepened and the visits between Whitmore House and Ashbourne Park continued to multiply, Eleanor found the ache of her earlier humiliation gradually giving way to something she had not expected to feel again so soon. A quiet, growing hope that perhaps her story was not yet finished being written, and that the next chapter might prove considerably kinder than the one that had come before. She did not yet know how soon that hope would be tested, or how directly Charles Pemberton and Louisa Fairfax would attempt to reassert themselves into a life they had so thoroughly damaged. But for the moment, walking beside Alexander Vane through the golden light of a fading autumn afternoon, Eleanor allowed herself, cautiously and completely, to simply be happy. That evening, after Ashbourne had departed and the house had settled into its usual quiet, Eleanor sat by her window and thought back over the encounter at the assembly, turning it over in her mind with something close to wonder. She had expected, if she ever crossed paths with Charles and Louisa again, to feel the same crushing humiliation that had gripped her on the night of the ball. Instead, she had felt only a calm, steady certainty in her own worth, a feeling so unfamiliar after months of doubt that she almost did not recognize it at first. She understood now what her father had meant when he spoke of character revealing itself over time. Charles had shown her, in the space of a single evening, exactly what kind of man he was. Quick to seek comfort in appearances, quick to recast his own failures as shared misfortune, unwilling even now to take true responsibility for the pain he had caused. Alexander, by contrast, had shown her patience, honesty, and a quiet strength that asks nothing of her except her genuine self. She thought, too, of her cousin Grace's teasing words from weeks before, about a duke who spoke to no one at balls finding someone he wished to speak to after all, and smiled softly into the darkness of her room. Whatever the coming months held, Eleanor found herself increasingly certain that the wreckage of her broken engagement had, against every expectation, cleared the way for something far better than what she had lost. Winter arrived early that year, dusting the fields around Whitmore House with a fine, silvery frost, and with it came an invitation that Eleanor accepted with far more confidence than she would have believed possible only months before. A grand supper party hosted by Lord and Lady Averley, the same family whose ballroom had once witnessed her deepest humiliation. "You do not have to attend," her mother said gently, watching Eleanor consider the invitation card at the breakfast table. "No one would think less of you for declining, given the history of that particular house." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I think I would rather reclaim it than avoid it forever." Ashbourne, when informed of the invitation during his next visit, offered to escort her personally, and Eleanor accepted without hesitation. In the weeks since the assembly where they had encountered Charles and Louisa, their courtship had deepened steadily, his visits now a settled and welcome fixture of her days. His intentions, though not yet formally declared, understood clearly enough by both families that Eleanor's mother had already begun quietly discussing wedding traditions with an enthusiasm Eleanor found equal parts touching and premature. "I do not wish to rush you," Ashbourne told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the frost-covered gardens of Whitmore House. "But I will tell you plainly, Eleanor, that my intentions toward you are serious, and have been since very nearly the moment we met." "I had begun to suspect as much," Eleanor said, smiling despite the cold air that stung her cheeks. "Though I confess I am glad to hear you say it directly. I have had quite enough of guessing at a man's true feelings." "Then you shall never have to guess again," he said. "Not where I am concerned." A few days before the supper, Ashbourne requested a private audience with Henry Whitmore, a meeting that lasted nearly an hour behind the closed door of her father's study, while Eleanor paced the hallway outside, too nervous to settle to any task. When the door finally opened, her father emerged with an expression she had not seen on his face since before Charles Pemberton had ever entered their lives, something like relief mixed with quiet, unmistakable pride. "Well?" Eleanor asked, unable to keep the anxiety from her voice. "The Duke has asked my permission to court you formally, with the clear intention of marriage, once he judges the timing appropriate," her father said, taking her hands in his. "I have given it gladly, Eleanor. I have rarely met a man I trust more completely with my daughter's happiness." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, though these were nothing like the tears she had shed on the night of the ball. "He has not yet spoken to me of marriage directly." "He will," her father said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent the better part of an hour discussing precisely that subject. "He wished to secure my blessing first, and to allow you time to be entirely certain of your own feelings before he asks anything further of you. I confess, I find that patience considerably more admirable than Pemberton's haste ever was." Word of the private meeting did not travel beyond the family, though Eleanor's mother could barely contain her satisfaction over the following days, humming softly to herself as she went about her usual tasks, occasionally pausing to study bridal fashion plates and periodicals she claimed to be reading for entirely unrelated reasons. Eleanor found herself equally unable to settle, caught between quiet joy and the lingering disbelief that her life, which had seemed so thoroughly ruined only months before, might now be moving towards something she had scarcely dared to hope for. It was against this backdrop of private happiness that the invitation to Lord Averley's supper arrived, and though Eleanor felt a flicker of old apprehension at the thought of returning to that particular house, she found her resolve considerably strengthened by the knowledge of what had passed between Ashbourne and her father only days before. The night of the Averley supper arrived with a clear, star-filled sky, and Eleanor found herself surprisingly calm as the carriage carried her toward the very house where her old life had ended so publicly. Ashbourne sat beside her, his presence steady and reassuring, and by the time they arrived, whatever nervousness she had carried had settled into something closer to quiet resolve. The supper itself passed pleasantly enough, the guest list smaller and more intimate than the ball had been, though Eleanor noted with a small, unwelcome jolt that Charles Pemberton and Louisa Fairfax were once again among the invited party, seated near the far end of the long table beside Lord Averley himself. It was after supper, as the guests moved into the drawing room for cards and conversation, that the confrontation Eleanor had not quite allowed herself to anticipate finally arrived. Louisa approached her first, catching Eleanor near the edge of the room while Ashbourne was momentarily engaged in conversation with their host across the chamber. "Eleanor," Louisa said, her voice pitched low but carrying an edge Eleanor had not heard from her before, something brittle and defensive. "I had hoped we might speak plainly, just the two of us, without an audience this time." "I do not believe we have anything further to discuss," Eleanor said evenly, though she made no move to walk away, curiosity and a hard-won steadiness keeping her rooted in place. "You have made your triumph quite clear," Louisa continued, ignoring the dismissal, her composure fraying visibly at the edges, "parading about the county on the arm of a duke, letting everyone whisper about how far you have risen above your circumstances. I hope it satisfies you, the way people now look at Charles and me." Eleanor felt a flash of genuine astonishment at the accusation, quickly followed by something firmer and considerably less patient. "I have paraded nothing, Louisa. I have simply lived my life, the same as you have lived yours. If people speak of us differently now, perhaps it is because they have finally seen both of us clearly." "That is unkind," Louisa said, her eyes bright with sudden tears. No, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but unwavering. Unkind was standing before 200 guests and announcing your engagement to my betrothed, without a single word of warning beforehand. Unkind was writing me 7 letters after the fact, hoping I might absolve you of a betrayal you had already decided was worth the cost. I have not been unkind to you, Louisa. I have simply stopped allowing your guilt to become my burden. Before Louisa could respond, Charles appeared at her side, his expression carrying the same forced pleasantness Eleanor had witnessed at the assembly, though something harder lurked beneath it tonight, some wounded pride finally finding its voice. I see congratulations are in order, he said, glancing pointedly toward where Ashbourne stood across the room, apparently still unaware of the exchange unfolding. A duke, no less. I confess I did not think you capable of aiming quite so high, Eleanor. The insult was thinly veiled, but Eleanor felt its intent clearly enough, an implication that her connection to Ashbourne was calculated ambition rather than genuine affection, a suggestion designed to diminish whatever happiness she had found in the wake of Charles's own cruelty. I did not aim for anything, Charles, Eleanor said, her voice carrying further than she perhaps intended, drawing the attention of several nearby guests who had begun to notice the tension gathering around the small group. I simply allowed myself to be treated with honesty and respect for the first time in years, and found, quite without seeking it, that such treatment led somewhere genuinely worthwhile. Perhaps you might try the same approach yourself, though I confess I have my doubts. You have grown rather sharp-tongued, Charles said, his composure slipping further, for a woman who once wept at the thought of losing me. The comment landed like a slap, cruel and calculated, meant to remind the gathering crowd of Eleanor's earlier vulnerability, to paint her renewed confidence as some brittle performance concealing lingering wounds. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, not with shame this time, but with genuine anger, a feeling she had rarely allowed herself over the preceding months. I wept, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of fury beneath it, because I believed, foolishly, that the man I loved was worthy of my grief. I have since learned otherwise, Charles, and I find I have not shed a single tear for you since. If you require reassurance of your own importance, I suggest you seek it elsewhere. You will find none remaining here. It was at this moment that Ashbourne arrived at her side, having crossed the room the moment he noticed the gathering crowd and Eleanor's rising color. He said nothing at first, simply positioning himself beside her with quiet, unmistakable solidarity, his presence alone enough to still the small crowd's murmured commentary. Is there a difficulty here? He asked, his voice pitched with deceptive calm, though Eleanor could feel the controlled tension radiating from him, a restrained anger far more formidable than anything Charles had managed to summon. No difficulty, Your Grace, Charles said quickly, his earlier bravado evaporating almost entirely beneath the Duke's steady, unimpressed gaze. Merely a conversation between old friends. I was not aware, Ashbourne said, that old friends generally required raised voices and cruelty to conduct their conversations. Perhaps my understanding of friendship differs considerably from your own. Charles had no response for that, his face reddening with a mixture of embarrassment and poorly concealed resentment. Louisa, for her part, had retreated a step, her earlier accusations apparently forgotten in the face of the Duke's cold, formidable attention. Miss Whitmore, Ashbourne continued, turning to Eleanor with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the ice in his voice moments before. Would you care to take some air? The room has grown rather stifling. I would like that very much, Eleanor said, grateful beyond measure for the graceful exit he offered. As they walked away, Eleanor heard Lord Averley's low, embarrassed murmur behind them, something about the impropriety of causing a scene at his supper table, directed clearly toward Charles rather than herself, and felt a small, satisfied warmth settle in her chest despite the lingering sting of Charles's words. Out on the terrace, the same terrace where they had first spoken months before, Ashbourne turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a seriousness Eleanor had not seen from him before. I am sorry you were forced to endure that, he said. I should have remained closer to your side this evening. I underestimated how far Pemberton's wounded pride might drive him. You have nothing to apologize for, Eleanor said. I managed well enough on my own, I think. You managed remarkably, Ashbourne agreed, though I confess it took every ounce of my restraint not to say considerably more to that man than propriety allowed. Eleanor laughed softly, some of the evening's tension finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. I begin to think, Your Grace, that you have a rather protective streak where I am concerned. I do, he said simply, no longer hiding behind formal distance. I find I cannot stand by and watch you diminished by people who never deserved the affection you once gave them so freely. You are worth considerably more than either of them ever recognized, Eleanor, and I intend to spend a great deal of time making certain you never forget it." The words settled over her like warmth after a long, bitter cold, and Eleanor felt something in her chest finally fully release, the last lingering doubt about her own worth dissolving beneath the steady certainty of his regard. "Thank you," she said softly, "for tonight, and for every day since that first evening on this very terrace." "You owe me no thanks," Ashbourne said. "I have simply recognized what was always there to be seen, if anyone had cared to look properly." They remained on the terrace a while longer, the cold night air sharp and clear around them, the muffled sounds of the party continuing behind the closed doors. When they finally returned inside, Eleanor noted that Charles and Louisa had already departed, their early exit the subject of quiet, knowing whispers among the remaining guests, whispers that, for once, cast no shadow over Eleanor's own reputation. The carriage ride home that night passed in comfortable silence, Eleanor resting her head lightly against the window, watching the frost-silvered fields slip past beneath a canopy of winter stars. She thought of Charles's cruel words and found, to her genuine surprise, that they had already begun to fade from importance, overshadowed entirely by the steady warmth of Ashbourne's defense, his quiet insistence that she deserved so much more than either Charles or Louisa had ever offered her. She did not yet know what the coming weeks would bring, whether Ashbourne's clear intentions would soon find their fullest expression, or how the county's whispers might shift once again in response. But she knew, with a certainty that had grown steadily since that first cold night on Lord Averley's terrace, that whatever came next, she would face it not as a woman defined by her past humiliation, but as one finally, fully reclaiming her own worth. As the carriage rolled on through the winter darkness toward Whitmore House, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time in nearly a year, to imagine a future entirely her own, built not on the ashes of Charles Pemberton's betrayal, but on something far steadier, far truer, and far more deeply deserved. The following morning, news of the confrontation at Lord Averley's supper had already begun circulating through the county, though to Eleanor's considerable relief, the accounts that reached her family painted a far kinder picture than she had expected. Several guests who had witnessed the exchange spoke plainly of Charles Pemberton's ungracious conduct, and of the quiet dignity with which Eleanor had answered his cruelty. For the first time since the night of the ball, Eleanor found herself the subject of sympathy that felt earned rather than pitying, admiration rather than gossip dressed as concern. "You handled yourself beautifully," her mother said over breakfast, setting down a letter from Mrs. Pembridge that recounted the previous evening in glowing terms. "I confess I worried when I first heard raised voices near the drawing room, but it seems the county has finally seen Charles Pemberton for exactly what he is." "I only wish it had not taken so long," Eleanor said, though there was little bitterness left in the observation, only a quiet, settled acceptance of how far she had traveled since that terrible night months before. Grace arrived that same afternoon, breathless with the news that had already reached her own household, eager to hear every detail directly from her cousin rather than through the increasingly embellished accounts already circulating. "He truly said that, in front of everyone?" Grace asked, eyes wide, after Eleanor had recounted Ashbourne's cool dismissal of Charles's insinuations. "I would have given a great deal to see Charles Pemberton's face in that moment." "It was rather satisfying," Eleanor admitted, allowing herself a small, genuine smile. "Though I confess the satisfaction mattered rather less to me than what came after, out on the terrace." "Do tell," Grace said, settling in with obvious anticipation. Eleanor found herself recounting Ashbourne's words carefully, his insistence that she deserved considerably more than either Charles or Louisa had ever offered, his quiet promise to spend considerable time ensuring she never again doubted her own worth. Grace listened with growing delight, clasping her hands together when Eleanor finished. "Eleanor, I do believe he means to marry you," Grace said, "and soon, unless I am very much mistaken." "Perhaps," Eleanor allowed, though the small, hopeful flutter in her chest suggested she believed it rather more certainly than her measured tone led on. That evening, alone in her room once more, Eleanor allowed herself to fully absorb everything the past days had brought her, her father's blessing, the confrontation weathered and survived, Ashbourne's steady, unwavering defense of her character, before a room full of witnesses who had once only known her as an object of pity. She thought of the frightened, humiliated woman who had fled onto a cold terrace nearly a year before, certain her life had been irreparably broken, and marveled at how far that woman had traveled since. Whatever the coming weeks held, Eleanor found herself entirely unafraid to face them, certain now, in a way she had never quite managed to be with Charles, that the man beside her valued her not despite her past humiliation, but had recognized her worth clearly enough to see past it entirely, straight to the woman she had always been underneath. The invitation arrived on a cold morning in early spring, thick cream paper bearing the familiar dark wine seal, announcing that the Duke of Ashbourne would host a grand ball at Ashbourne Park to celebrate the coming season, with the entire county invited to attend. Eleanor read the invitation twice, though she required no second reading to understand its significance. In the months since the confrontation at Lord Averley's supper, her courtship with Ashbourne had continued to deepen, his visits now a daily fixture rather than a weekly one, his affection expressed openly rather than carefully guarded as it had been in those earlier, more uncertain days. And yet he had said nothing further of marriage since her father's private blessing months before, and Eleanor had begun, despite her best efforts at patience, to wonder when, or whether, he intended to speak the words she had come to hope for with her whole heart. "A ball," her mother said, reading over Eleanor's shoulder with poorly concealed excitement. "His first, in all the years he has held the title. Eleanor, this cannot be coincidence." "Mother," Eleanor said, though her own pulse had quickened considerably at the thought, "we should not assume anything. Perhaps he simply wishes to open his home to the county at last." But even as she spoke the words, Eleanor found herself remembering every small sign of the preceding months, the steady, unwavering devotion in his eyes, the careful way he spoke of their future together, as though it were already settled between them, needing only the formal words to make it official. She allowed herself, cautiously, to hope. The weeks leading up to the ball passed in a flurry of preparation. A new gown was commissioned, deep sapphire silk that Eleanor's mother insisted upon despite Eleanor's protests about the expense, declaring firmly that some occasions warranted a mother's insistence regardless of practical objections. Grace arrived a full week early to help with preparations, her excitement barely contained, certain in a way Eleanor did not quite dare to be herself, that the evening ahead would prove momentous. "You do realize," Grace said, the night before the ball, as she helped Eleanor practice pinning her hair in an elaborate style borrowed from a fashion periodical, "that this is the very ballroom, in the very county, where your entire fortune changed course a year ago. There is a certain poetry in it, don't you think, if he means to do what I suspect he means to do?" "I have thought of little else," Eleanor admitted quietly, "though I confess I am nervous in a way I have not been since that terrible night at Lord Averley's house." "A different kind of nervous, surely," Grace said gently. "Entirely different," Eleanor agreed, and found, despite the flutter of anxious anticipation in her chest, that she was smiling. The night of the ball arrived clear and mild, the first true evening of spring, and Ashbourne Park glowed with warm golden light as carriages began arriving along the long gravel drive well before the appointed hour. Eleanor's own carriage joined the procession, her parents seated across from her, her father reaching over at one point to squeeze her hand with quiet, knowing affection. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, "know that I have never been prouder of the woman you have become this past year." Eleanor's throat tightened with emotion, and she managed only a small, grateful nod in response, before the carriage drew to a stop before the grand entrance, where liveried footmen stood ready to receive the arriving guests. The ballroom itself, when Eleanor entered on her father's arm, took her breath away entirely. Ashbourne had spared no expense, banks of white flowers arranged along every surface, hundreds of candles casting the room in warm, flattering light, an orchestra already tuning their instruments on a raised platform at the far end of the room. It was, in every measurable way, grander than Lord Averley's ballroom had ever been, and yet Eleanor felt none of the old anxiety that space had once represented, only a quiet, steady anticipation for whatever the evening might bring. Ashbourne found her within minutes of her arrival, cutting cleanly through the gathering crowd with the easy confidence of a man perfectly at home in his own domain, though his eyes, when they met Eleanor's, carried something softer and considerably more vulnerable than mere social ease. "You look extraordinary," he said, bowing over her hand with a formality that did not entirely mask the warmth beneath it. "I confess, I have been counting the hours until your arrival." "The house is beautiful, Your Grace," Eleanor said, glancing around at the transformed ballroom. "I did not realize you intended such a grand occasion." "Some occasions," he said, his gaze steady on hers, "warrant grandness. I hope, before the evening ends, you will understand precisely why I chose to make this one so." Eleanor's heart began to beat considerably faster at the weight in his words, though the arrival of other guests soon drew them both into the customary rounds of greeting and conversation that any grand ball demanded. Eleanor danced twice with Ashbourne over the following hour, once with a visiting gentleman friend of Charlotte's, and spent a pleasant interval discussing the flower arrangements with Mrs. Pembridge, who had apparently forgiven, or at least forgotten, her earlier comment at Ashbourne Park months before. She caught sight of Charles and Louisa only once during the evening's early hours, standing near the refreshment table, with expressions considerably more subdued than their triumphant bearing at Lord Averley's ball the previous year. Neither approached her, and Eleanor found she felt nothing beyond mild, distant curiosity at their presence, the sharp sting of old betrayal having faded, over the months since, into something closer to simple, unremarkable history. During a brief pause between dances, Charlotte found Eleanor near the edge of the room, her eyes bright with an excitement she seemed to be struggling valiantly to contain. "You look as though you are keeping a great secret," Eleanor observed, studying her friend's flushed cheeks with growing suspicion. "I am keeping several," Charlotte admitted, laughing. "My brother would have my head if I revealed even one of them. I will say only this, Eleanor, that you should not be surprised by anything that happens before this evening concludes." "Charlotte," Eleanor said, half laughing, half genuinely nervous now, "you cannot say such a thing and then refuse to explain yourself." "I can, and I shall," Charlotte said, entirely unrepentant, though she squeezed Eleanor's hand warmly before being swept away by a waiting dance partner. "Enjoy the evening, Eleanor. I promise you will not regret it." Eleanor spent the following quarter hour attempting, with limited success, to appear composed, her mind racing through every possibility Charlotte's cryptic words might suggest, though she scarcely dared to settle on the one she hoped for most. She found her mother watching her from across the room with an expression of poorly disguised delight, and her father deep in quiet conversation with Ashbourne near the terrace doors, the two men's heads bent together in a manner that struck Eleanor as considerably more serious than idle small talk. When Ashbourne returned to her side some time later, escorting her onto the floor for a lively country dance, Eleanor studied his face carefully, searching for some sign of what Charlotte's words and her father's private conversation might mean. "You seem distracted this evening, Miss Whitmore," Ashbourne said, though the warmth in his eyes suggested he was not entirely displeased by her evident preoccupation. "I confess I am," Eleanor admitted. "Your sister has been dropping hints all evening that I cannot quite decipher, and I noticed you speaking rather seriously with my father a short while ago." "Charlotte," Ashbourne said, with the particular exasperated fondness of an older brother, "has never once in her life managed to keep a secret entirely to herself. I shall have words with her later." "Then there is a secret," Eleanor pressed, though she kept her tone light, teasing rather than demanding. "There may be," Ashbourne allowed, his eyes dancing with quiet amusement even as his expression remained otherwise composed. "You will simply have to be patient a while longer, Miss Whitmore. I promise the wait will prove worthwhile." The dance carried them apart and together again through its familiar patterns, and Eleanor found herself laughing more freely than she had in longer than she could remember, the last vestiges of old anxiety finally dissolving entirely beneath the warm, golden atmosphere of the ballroom and the steady presence of the man beside her. Whatever secret Charlotte and her father shared with Ashbourne, Eleanor found she trusted him completely enough to simply enjoy the not knowing, certain that whatever came would bring her nothing but happiness. As the dance concluded and Ashbourne led her from the floor, his hand lingering warmly at the small of her back, Eleanor caught sight of the great clock near the ballroom entrance and realized with some surprise how quickly the hours had passed. Supper had come and gone, the guests had grown pleasantly relaxed with wine and conversation, and the orchestra had begun easing into slower, more romantic pieces as the night deepened toward its later hours. It was well past midnight, as the ball approached its final hours, that Ashbourne appeared at Eleanor's side once more, his expression carrying a seriousness that immediately drew her full attention. "Would you dance with me once more?" he asked, and something in his voice told her this request carried considerably more weight than a simple invitation to the floor. Eleanor placed her hand in his without hesitation, and as the orchestra began a slow, elegant waltz, Ashbourne led her not toward the center of the crowded floor, but toward a clearing near the raised dais where the orchestra played, a space that, Eleanor realized with a sudden rush of understanding, placed them clearly visible to the entire assembled company. The music continued for perhaps half a minute before Ashbourne, rather than continuing the dance, raised a hand to signal the orchestra, and the music gradually faded into silence. The gathered guests, sensing something significant unfolding, began to quiet as well, turning their attention toward the couple standing at the center of the room. Eleanor's heart pounded so fiercely she was certain the entire room must hear it, and she found herself unable to look anywhere except into Ashbourne's steady gray eyes as he lowered himself, deliberately and without hesitation, onto one knee before her. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom, steady despite the emotion evident beneath it. "A year ago, in a room not unlike this one, you were made to stand before an audience and endure a moment no one should ever have to face. I cannot undo that pain, though I have wished, every day since, that I could. But I can offer you this instead, before every witness gathered here tonight, so that this room, and this county, might remember you not as a woman who was once discarded, but as a woman who was, in the end, chosen completely, and without reservation, by a man who considers himself the most fortunate soul in England for having found her." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Eleanor felt tears gathering, though these carried none of the anguish of the tears she had shed a year before. "I love you," Ashbourne continued, his eyes never leaving hers, "not for the grace with which you weathered a cruelty you did not deserve, though I have admired that grace beyond measure. I love you for your honesty, your quiet strength, your refusal to let the world's unkindness diminish the truth of who you are. Will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Eleanor could not speak at all, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment, by the sea of faces watching, by the steady, unwavering devotion in the eyes of the man kneeling before her. She thought fleetingly of that terrible night a year past, of Charles's careless cruelty and Louisa's quiet betrayal, and found that the memory, for the first time, carried no power over her whatsoever. It belonged entirely to the past, a chapter closed and finished, giving way now to something infinitely better. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly with emotion, though the word carried absolute certainty. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." The ballroom erupted into applause and delighted exclamations as Ashbourne rose to his feet and drew her into an embrace that spoke considerably more of genuine relief and joy than any formal propriety might have dictated for such a public setting. Eleanor caught sight of her mother weeping openly with happiness, her father beaming with unrestrained pride, Grace clapping so enthusiastically that her own hair had begun to come loose from its careful pins. Across the room, she caught one final glimpse of Charles Pemberton's face, pale and unreadable, and Louisa beside him, her expression carrying something that might have been regret, though Eleanor found she no longer cared enough to examine it closely. Whatever pain they had once caused her belonged entirely to a different woman, a different life, one she had left behind completely somewhere over the course of the past extraordinary year. "I believe," Ashbourne murmured against her ear, as the orchestra struck up a joyful new tune and the guests began to close around them with congratulations, "that we have given this ballroom rather a better story to remember than the one it witnessed a year ago." Eleanor laughed, genuine and unguarded, tears of happiness still bright in her eyes. "I believe we have, Your Grace. I believe we truly have." Her parents reached them soon after, her mother embracing Eleanor with tears streaming freely down her cheeks, her father shaking Ashbourne's hand with a firmness that spoke volumes beyond any formal words of congratulation. Grace arrived moments later, nearly breathless with excitement, throwing her arms around her cousin with a delighted laugh. "I knew it," Grace declared. "I told you, months ago, that a duke does not extend such attention without serious purpose. Oh, Eleanor, I am so very happy for you." Charlotte appeared as well, embracing Eleanor warmly before turning to her brother with an expression of exaggerated relief. "At last. I thought you might never work up the courage to ask her, Alexander, and I should have been forced to intervene on your behalf." "Your restraint has been noted and appreciated," Ashbourne said dryly, though the affection in his voice for his sister was unmistakable, and the small gathering around them laughed warmly at the exchange. Mrs. Pembridge appeared soon after, along with a steady stream of well-wishers eager to offer their congratulations, and Eleanor found herself, for the better part of an hour, swept along in a warm current of embraces and delighted exclamations, the entire ballroom seemingly united in genuine happiness for the match. It was, she reflected, an entirely different experience from the whispered judgments and pitying glances that had followed her through this same county only a year before, and the contrast left her quietly, profoundly grateful for everything that had brought her to this moment. As the celebration continued long into the night, Eleanor found herself, again and again, returning to a single quiet realization, that the humiliation which had once seemed to mark the ending of everything she valued had, in truth, only cleared the way for a beginning far more extraordinary than she had ever dared to imagine. The girl who had fled onto a cold terrace a year before, certain her heart was broken beyond repair, had found in the end something considerably stronger and truer waiting for her on the other side of that pain. And as Alexander Vane, Duke of Ashbourne, led her back onto the dance floor before the entire delighted assembly, Eleanor Whitmore understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that she had never once been broken at all. She had simply been waiting, patiently and without knowing it, for the life that was always meant to find her. Spring gave way to summer, and Whitmore House filled with the steady bustle of wedding preparations, seamstresses arriving weekly with fabric samples, letters of congratulation piling high upon the hall table, and Eleanor's mother moving through the household with an energy Eleanor had not seen from her in years, directing every detail with the focused determination of a woman finally given full license to indulge her long-suppressed enthusiasm for such occasions. "You will not recognize your own wedding by the time your mother finishes with it," Henry Whitmore observed dryly one evening, watching his wife pore over yet another set of fabric swatches spread across the parlor table. "I begin to fear she has more opinions about your gown than you do yourself." "I do not mind," Eleanor said, smiling as she watched her mother's animated discussion with the visiting seamstress. "She has waited a long time to see me happy, father. Let her enjoy every moment of it." The wedding was set for early autumn, a full year and more removed from the night Charles Pemberton had shattered Eleanor's expectations before an entire ballroom, and Eleanor found a quiet, deliberate satisfaction in that timing, in the knowledge that her new beginning would arrive precisely when the season turned, echoing the very changing of seasons that had carried her through grief toward genuine happiness. Ashbourne visited nearly every day throughout that summer, and Eleanor found their courtship deepening still further as wedding preparations progressed, conversations stretching long into golden evenings as they discussed everything from the management of his considerable estates, which she would soon share responsibility for, to smaller, more personal matters, the names they might someday give their children, the modest charitable causes throughout the county that Ashbourne had quietly supported for years, and that Eleanor now found herself eager to champion alongside him. "I have been thinking," Eleanor told him one warm evening, as they walked together through the gardens of Ashbourne Park, the estate that would soon become her permanent home, "that I should like to establish a small fund, perhaps through the parish, to assist young women who find themselves in difficult circumstances, whatever the nature of those circumstances might be. I know now, better than most, how quickly a woman's reputation and prospects can be threatened through no true fault of her own." Ashbourne studied her with evident admiration, taking her hand as they continued along the garden path. "I think that is a wonderful idea, and I will support it fully, in whatever form you wish to see it take." "You do not think it presumptuous?" Eleanor asked, "for a woman who has not even become a duchess yet, to already be planning her charitable ventures?" "I think," Ashbourne said, stopping to face her fully, "that it is entirely in keeping with the character I fell in love with from the very first evening we spoke. You have never once let your own suffering make you smaller, Eleanor. Instead, you have let it teach you exactly how you wish to move through the world. I consider that among your finest qualities." Word of Eleanor's engagement, and the manner in which it had been announced, had by this point traveled well beyond the borders of their own county, and Eleanor found herself the subject of considerably kinder attention than she had known in the months immediately following Charles's betrayal. Invitations arrived regularly from families who had scarcely acknowledged her existence a year before, and though Eleanor accepted only those she genuinely wished to attend, she found a quiet, private satisfaction in the shift, evidence, however imperfect, that character eventually revealed itself plainly enough for even the most careless observers to recognize. Of Charles Pemberton and Louisa Fairfax, Eleanor heard little in the months that followed, save for occasional, unremarkable mentions in the general gossip of the county. Their own wedding had apparently proceeded quietly, without the grandness Charles had once seemed so eager to display, and Eleanor found she genuinely wished them no particular ill will, only a distant, settled indifference that spoke more clearly than anger ever could, of how completely she had moved beyond the pain they had once caused her. "Do you ever think of them?" Grace asked one afternoon, as the two cousins sat together in the Whitmore garden, addressing invitations for the approaching wedding. "Rarely," Eleanor admitted, considering the question honestly. "I think, sometimes, of the woman I was before that night, and I find I scarcely recognize her anymore. She believed her happiness depended entirely on a man who never truly valued her. I know better now." "And what does your happiness depend on now?" Grace asked, smiling. "On myself, mostly," Eleanor said, after a thoughtful pause. "Alexander has taught me a great deal about trust and honesty, and I am endlessly grateful for the life we are building together. But I think the truest gift this past year has given me is simply learning my own worth, independent of anyone else's regard. Everything else has followed naturally from that." In the final weeks before the wedding, An unexpected letter arrived at Whitmore House, its handwriting immediately familiar, despite the many months since Eleanor had last seen it. Louisa had written once more, though this time Eleanor found herself, after a long moment of consideration, willing to break the seal. The letter was brief, and considerably more humble than the 7 that had preceded it so long ago. Louisa wrote simply that she had heard of the engagement, that she wished Eleanor genuine happiness, and that she understood, now more fully than she once had, the weight of what her own choices had cost a friendship she had never properly valued, until it was already lost. She did not ask for forgiveness, nor did she request any renewed acquaintance. She wrote only to say, plainly and without excuse, that she was sorry, and that she hoped Eleanor had found, in the Duke of Ashbourne, a happiness far greater than anything she herself had once carelessly threatened. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long while after reading it, turning the words over carefully in her mind. She did not feel moved to renew the friendship Louisa's betrayal had ended so completely, nor did she feel any particular need to respond at length. But she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she no longer carried any real anger toward the words on the page, only a distant, settled understanding that people sometimes made choices they came to regret, and that holding tightly to old wounds served her own happiness far less than releasing them entirely. She wrote back only a few short lines, thanking Louisa for her honesty and wishing her well in return, before setting the matter aside for good, another small piece of her old life folded neatly away, to make room for the one now unfolding before her. Ashbourne, when she mentioned the exchange to him that evening, studied her with quiet admiration. Most people would not have extended even that much grace, he said. Perhaps not, Eleanor said, but I find I would rather spend my energy building the life ahead of me than guarding old grievances behind me. There is simply no room left for both. The wedding day itself arrived beneath a clear autumn sky, the same crisp golden light that had marked the anniversary of Eleanor's original humiliation, now transformed entirely into a celebration of everything that had grown from its aftermath. The parish church overflowed with guests, family and friends and county acquaintances alike, all gathered to witness the joining of the Duke of Ashbourne and Miss Eleanor Whitmore, a match that had, over the preceding year, become something of a local legend, whispered about not with pity or scorn, but with genuine admiration for the resilience and grace with which Eleanor had rebuilt her life from the ruins Charles Pemberton had left behind. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, dressed in ivory silk that caught the light streaming through the church's high windows, and found, as she caught sight of Alexander waiting for her at the altar, that every trace of the old fear and doubt she had once carried had finally, completely dissolved. He watched her approach with an expression of such open, unguarded devotion that Eleanor felt tears gathering, happy tears this time, entirely unlike the ones that had marked her lowest moment a year before. The ceremony itself passed in a warm, joyful blur, vows exchanged with quiet sincerity, the church bells ringing out across the county afterward, to announce the new Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne to all who might hear them. The wedding breakfast that followed at Ashbourne Park stretched long into the afternoon, filled with laughter and toasts and the easy, contented warmth of a celebration built on genuine happiness rather than mere social obligation. Later that evening, as the last of the guests finally departed, and the great house settled into quiet, Eleanor stood with her husband on the same terrace where they had first spoken, nearly 2 years before, on a night that had once seemed to mark the ending of everything she valued. "I have thought often," Eleanor said, leaning against the stone balustrade and looking out over the darkened gardens, "of how strange it is that the worst night of my life led me, eventually, to the very best. I do not know that I would change any of it, even the pain, knowing where it eventually carried me." Alexander drew her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "I have thought the same, many times. I believe some sorrows serve a purpose we cannot see clearly until we have traveled well beyond them. I am endlessly grateful that yours led you to this terrace, and to me." "As am I," Eleanor said softly, resting her head against his shoulder, watching the stars emerge slowly over the darkened gardens below. She thought, one final time, of the frightened, humiliated young woman who had fled onto this very terrace nearly 2 years before, certain her future had been irreparably broken by a single cruel evening. That woman felt like a distant memory now, a chapter closed and finished, giving way to a life considerably richer and truer than anything Charles Pemberton could ever have offered her. Eleanor Whitmore, now Duchess of Ashbourne, understood at last what she had only begun to suspect on that first difficult night, that being cast aside by someone unworthy of her devotion was never truly an ending, but simply the clearing of space for a beginning far better than she had ever dared to imagine. And as she stood on that quiet terrace beside the man who had seen her worth from the very first moment, surrounded by the promise of a lifetime still unfolding before them, Eleanor felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at peace. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, an owl called softly into the darkness, and the last candles inside the great house flickered low as the household finally settled into sleep. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened to the steady, familiar rhythm of her husband's breathing beside her, grateful beyond measure for every difficult step that had carried her, at last, to this quiet, contented ending, and to the beginning that would now stretch on before them, season after season, for the whole of their shared life together.